Hi everyone. So today we have Amelia Burd here, and Amelia was born in Russia, immigrated to Israel when she was a baby, 8 months old, and then at 8 years old she moved to the U.S. with her family and moved to San Francisco, where she's built a successful career in the high-tech sector, in the intersection between customer success, relation management, and account management. And today we'll be talking about Amelia's immigrant journey in the US and Israel, and what it's like for her to be an American, Israeli, Russian, Jewish person. And so we can get into it. So I gave a short intro, but Amelia, please tell us your immigrant story and
Sure.
your family's history, your history, and also a bit about your career.
Sure. So I'm Amelia, as Euler just mentioned. My story probably started even before I was born. So my parents, I believe, got married in '88. My father was already considering that it's really time to move away from Russia, like many other immigrants did at the time as well. The rest of the family wasn't on board yet, especially the women. And then when my mother was pregnant with me, finally, after lots of discussion, interesting to reflect on this now during the pandemic, she realized she can go to the store and buy essential things for a baby, like milk
Mm.
and meat. And it was long line. And so she came home one day to my father and was like, I don't care where, let's just get out of here. I don't want to raise a child in these conditions.
Mm.
And right away he went to, I was born in a town or city called Yaroslavl, which is 4 or 5 hours away from Moscow. Population is apparently very similar to roughly 1 million residents, a little bit below, just like San Francisco's population. And so at the time, my father would go like in the morning, 5, 6 in the morning, go to Moscow to get essential things like milk and like meat,
Mhm.
and then come back. So under those conditions, of course, my father went to the Moscow embassy and we started the process of just leaving the Soviet Union. The original plan was to go to the US, but then with the whole immigration and laws at the time, the border was already close to the US. And me and my whole family, we immigrated to Israel.
What year was that?
It was 1990, September, late August, early September 1990. Um,
So
and so,
actually, sorry, I just want to interject for people who are
sure.
not as familiar with USSR. USSR during the communism didn't actually allow people to travel abroad and leave the border, leave the country at all, unless you had a diplomatic passport. So what happened is that in the late 80s, there was a period called perestroika where the regime started changing and becoming a bit more open, and that was when a lot of Russian and Jewish people started leaving the country, and that's how a lot of the Russian Jewish population dispersed to the US, Israel, Germany, Canada, and so forth.
In the
So just a little,
millions of that. Yeah,
yeah. Okay, sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, exactly. And so me and my immediate family, and my whole dad's side of the family, we all came to Israel together. We settled in the north, Haifa, where you're from as well. Um, I know in the early days, we were all in one apartment. My parents came, I think, with less than $100, um, like any other immigrant, really. They got some sort of basket help, like Sakrita from Israel. We all lived in one apartment. I heard from those times that literally we all lived together. It was me, my grandparents, my aunt and uncle, and there was sort of the idea this is how it is, it's fine. We all got along really well. So it was a temporary situation. After 6 months, everybody sort of decided to move to their own apartments. And that's where my memories first start. Actually, my parents bought young, I guess, but they just bought an apartment in Haifa, in a neighborhood I do not remember in, but those were really my first memories are. So it was at the time that we got also our first computer, for example, and I remember playing chess for the first time on a computer, not
Wow,
understanding how this works. I must have been 3 or 4.
that's
At that,
amazing.
yeah,
Wow.
that's my first memory with a computer is playing chess, how Russian Jewish, obviously playing chess. Um, At the time, I had a pretty good childhood in general at those times. My parents started doing manual work in Israel. So my father worked in the Israeli version of PG&E Bezek doing manual work. Um, my mother sort of started just delivering mail, and and it was actually the most money they ever had in their life, so they were pretty happy. And then some life or something was unexpected that happened with my father, and he decided what next, and he decided to try out software engineering. This is back in
Mhm.
92, probably 93. Worked really hard, did it by himself, and so long story short, he switched to software engineering. My mother, who's a former physicist, he then switched her to software engineering with time. And then after 4 years, we
And
switched.
what
Yeah,
was your dad's original profession
he
from
was an
Russia?
electrical engineer by trade.
Okay.
So he was an electrical engineer by trade. My mother was a physicist. So they both had very smart analytical minds. But
Hmm.
like many millions of immigrants at that time, you just come to a new country, unknown, you don't know what to do, and then you just simply start working because you need to. Um, so then after 4 years, so in those times, it was good. I grew up around my grandparents, helped raise me, was very close with them. And then we moved to where I consider home, to some degree, because that's where my childhood memories start to form. Kfar Saba, which is today it's a city, but I considered it a town back then, not far from Tel Aviv, in the center. It was very much sort of like an Israeli type of town. We settled
Hmm.
in there. That was the first time I got my first room, which was exciting. I must have been age, I think six, yeah, 5, 6 or so, right before I started first grade. Um,
Was your
and
brother born already at that time?
my brother was born when I was 8 years old. Yeah.
Okay. So you
So
had a room all to yourself.
I had a
Wow.
room
And a
all to
single
myself.
child. Oh,
Exactly. Yeah.
so
Even
fun.
when my brother was born, I still always had a room.
Yeah, so
So
cool.
it was very much like that. And that's where sort of lifestyle in Israel in general, when you're a kid, you start walking by yourself at age 6. So I made two really good friends. I went to school. I was an excellent, of course, student.
Hmm.
Like sort of I was supposed to. Like in my family, the way I grew up is, especially men really push the women, and like you can be anything, do something. You're definitely going to either UC Berkeley or Technion. Like that was clear from age 5. Um,
Wow.
and I was like, sure, obviously. Um, and I was in an Israeli class. I made two really good friends that were actually still friends today. And we did everything like together. We went to school, we went to the library, you would go to the store. Literally in Israel, most parents, both of them work. So I would just like go by myself everywhere. School environment was, I would say, that's probably the first time sort of I felt quote unquote othered. So people would say, like, especially in those times, they would call me Russian or go back to Russia.
Hmm.
Um, and the way I felt about it is, first of all, is the only home I've known at the time was Israel. So, like, I don't know if I would even go to Russia even as a child. It would be a
Hmm.
completely foreign place for me, number one. Um, but what it led to me is, I wouldn't say necessarily hiding that I'm a Russian Jewish, but not necessarily proud about it either. Somewhere in the point that I felt very Israeli, there was a time as a child, I'll be honest, I wish my parents were native born Israeli. So there wouldn't be this way to other me and to make sure that I'm somehow other, even though I was as Israeli as all the other kids, growing up only pretty much in an Israeli environment. Definitely my grandparents spoke Russian to me. Definitely at home we actually spoke Hebrew. My parents, of course, between themselves spoke Russian. Um, so
How did they speak, how did they know Hebrew at that point to even speak to you?
So my parents just came to Israel. My father already started illegally studying Hebrew in even in Russia. My parents are both very talented with languages and actually caught on to Hebrew pretty quickly. I think the
Hmm.
fact that we spoke Hebrew at home probably didn't come from them as much as it came from me, of course, right, coming from school. And I grew up in an environment where I think pretty unique to my story, there wasn't that big sense of you need to keep the language, and we're going to insist on you
Hmm.
learning Russian. Having said that, they did send me though to like an after school program to learn read and write at age 8 or 9. But it was never the point that like you have to do it. It's more that this
Mm-hmm.
is sort of so it definitely felt like I was in both cultures for sure. But I felt definitely more Israeli than um, also came from Russian speaking families as well, but they also sort of grew up in Israel and everything. Yulia, do you hear me? Because you froze. Did you hear what I said?
I think I lost
Hello? Oh,
okay.
yeah, it's
I
the yeah, so anyway,
missed
yeah. Yeah, so pretty much what I was saying is that in general I felt like more Israeli than anything. Definitely felt like in school they were othered me. But I would say it never felt, even as a child, it never felt that it was because necessarily I was Russian or something, as much as it felt like Israeli kids are just mean, and they would. And in general, I felt that they would be mean no matter what. So if I wouldn't be Russian, it would have been over something else. That
Mhm.
just in general, I felt Israeli society. The other interesting thing is, and now I'll get to coming to the US, is Israeli system, just like American system, by the way, when you grow up, say how good Israel is, the success of it, you definitely feel very Israeli. Just like when it came to the US, I felt very much American. The story in elementary school. So for me was the fact that I did not like my school environment. I didn't like the other kids socially, so, but it never felt like it was something necessarily that's a reflection on the whole state of Israel and the state of how I feel Israel, which is interesting as I grow older. Um, Pretty much then, in general, just to jump a bit, there were murmurs for going to the US. They didn't really explain as a child what was going on. I was 8 and a half. My mother started teaching me before to read and write, in English, so I had at least that basis. And then we just simply got on the plane, me, my brother, and my mother. My father came 2 weeks earlier. And we came to pretty much Northern California, a suburb not far away from San Francisco, hour away in the East Bay, Walnut Creek. Very much American suburb, white picket fence, very American sort of lifestyle. Exactly as one would exactly imagine how America to be. Um, and I think I'll expand more, but in general, for me, the first shock was lifestyle, because we were in the suburbs. There was no really, you can go to the store easily or library or etc. And then we moved to Silicon Valley, went to high school, decided to rebel and not go to UC Berkeley and go to UCLA instead. Along the way, I thought of whether I wanted to, at first, I wanted to be a professor, then I wanted to do public policy, and then eventually I ended up in high tech, which I would always say was sort of by accident. But now looking back, I'm sort of grateful for how life turned out and things worked out well. That's the short story, but I'm sure I will expand as we go on.
Yeah, thank you. That's so great and very interesting to even hear the behind the scenes of your parents. And I'm glad you touched also on what it was like to be in Israel versus the US. So before we jump into the other questions I have, I'm just curious, when you came to the US, did you have a similar experience like in Israel where you felt, or I mean, I'm sure you feel different because you are, but what was it like with this in the school environment and the way that the kids treat you? Was it different?
So what's interesting is from a social standpoint, I think I felt similar in the US and Israel where I felt like I didn't necessarily super fit in socially. Um, the difference is, at least in Israel, at least I made 2 or 3 really good friends that we would do everything together. So I still felt like an outcast, but I would get, at least I had two or three really good friends that we would do everything together. In the US, what ended up happening is, first of all, you come to a new country. You're trying to form, even at age 8, your identity. I felt sort of my independence taken away because I can't simply just get up and go to the store or go to the library or go to the park, which I could easily do in Israel. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
so the other thing is that when you move like countries twice, my idea of identity versus my parents is actually very different. So my parents right away when they moved got Russian speaking, of course, friends, and then they had their kids and we were young, and so we'd end up being together, but they never felt like necessarily friends or necessarily felt like we had something in common. So the suburb that I was in, there were only a few other Russian speaking people. There were no really like at that time Israeli kids to speak Hebrew with, and so I didn't feel necessarily super close to those of the Russian background because I came from Israel and not Russia, even though I do speak the language. Um, so it was hard for me socially to find really good friends, actually, probably till age 18. Um, and I'm an extrovert, so I never felt like I fit in perfectly socially with somebody till much later in life. Um, Compared to Israel, the school system here is that in Israel it's sort of a lot more direct and very direct sort of culture. So in Israel, a lot more sort of if they don't like it, they'll tell you in your face. If they're being mean, they might punch you or do some very mean things to you. I didn't
Wow.
get punched. I'm just in general. There were other things, but that's not the point. But the point is, you knew for sure that they didn't like you. Versus in the US, if they didn't like you, it was sort of if you've ever seen Mean Girls or any other sort of more behind the scenes gossip and you feel it and you know, but it's not super outright like Israeli culture. I think that was like a big difference. So I never really knew, even now looking back, if I ever attributed it to being an immigrant as much as, but it could be as much as it was like a new environment. And I never felt like I fit in perfectly in that environment, having sort of two cultures in me, being very unique within that environment and sort of not at that time when I was a child, we didn't sort of, there were no other like really Israeli speaking people around me. So that was tough for me from that perspective. Academically, it was weird to me too because in Israel at that time I came here during fourth grade, it was very advanced. And so when I came here, the first year was just four, and I learned English pretty quickly. They said you need within 3 months because I needed to communicate. Um,
Mhm.
and so that was really my experience, I would say, in that um, it's you still the same sort of feeling that you don't fit in and maybe socially a little bit of an outcast, but the way you feel it in the US is different than in Israel. And in the US, it was never I never felt so much from the other kids it's because I'm an immigrant, but simply just because I simply didn't somehow fit in socially, which bothered me for a long time actually because that's the thing that was actually I'm an extrovert and I like being around people. So as a child, that was actually
Mhm.
pretty hard on me. Yeah.
Mhm. I totally get that. Yeah. And I think when you are an immigrant, for me too, for a long time I struggle with the fact that nobody gets you 100%,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
And like all these components of you, and it's only when I got older that I realized being an immigrant in itself is a kind of identity, and I started
definitely.
relating to people like that. But I could never find people that were like, I mean, unless they were exactly like me, which is in your case
Exactly.
true. And
Yeah,
then even with that population, right? Like people are
exactly.
still different people.
And we all have still different personalities. So I think you touched on
Yeah.
the point is I don't even know how much it was as much as I was an immigrant or as much as because I'm an immigrant I have unique personality trait. Hence all of that combined was just hard in my
Mhm.
case to find the social right thing until much later in life, just like in your case. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit about when you were in the US? And as you were growing up and becoming an adult, what are some culture clashes that you started noticing, and how did you find a way to deal with it, to balance the multiple
Yeah.
cultures you're part of? Like, what kind of choices did you make in terms of what you want to keep, what you want to let go of either culture?
Yeah, this is an interesting question that comes more into focus, especially as we get older and we make more choices, right now with careers and relationships. But I would say there's a few. The first culture clashes that I touched a little bit upon is how do you define independence? Even as a child, and it actually kept on going as I was growing older, because in Israel, sort of, I felt independent as a child that you sort of went everywhere and parents were working, so they were a little bit more hands off, and that was considered normal. Whereas here I came, it was interesting to see suddenly parents very involved in school with PTAs and so on, and I didn't come from that environment. And my parents sort of assumed, just like in Israel, I'm mature and I'll take care of things. They had tons of other things to worry about. And interesting, we looked back of, my parents said we wish we would be a little bit more there and a little bit more involved, but nobody knew. So it's just the way it is. So I got older, there was the clash exactly. In terms of what's interesting and good is compared to my friends, I never had the culture clash of I could always do what I wanted to do. But the interesting asterisk I would say to that is I think it has to do because I'm a woman. I got a little bit more leeway regarding what I wanted to do, what I wanted to major, as long as I was sort of a good student. So the other clash, especially when I got older and an adult, is moving out actually was a big one. Because from my parents' perspective, they're like, we achieved the house, you can stay here as long as you want, continue working. We don't understand what's this need to sort of move out and be independent when we did it out of necessity, and your job is not that far away from our house anyway. We don't fully understand that. And so I have that clash of sort of, I am on good relationship with my parents anyway, compared to what my American friends say, sometimes they're not, etc. At the same time, explaining to people my age, where like, especially when I was younger, I don't live with my parents because I can't afford, but because sort of culturally, sort of like it's gonna be a huge scandal, and I don't see the reason to do that. Um, um, there is some, and the other thing, it's not fully the same. For example, I know in Indian culture it's sort of similar, but it's not to that extent like so that was probably the biggest culture clash for me as well, navigating adulthood, whereas I make money as an American, everything is really good, independent, sort of that thing of like really wanting to move far away, but does it make sense if my job is here? They want to be closer to my friends. On the other hand, my parents, so that has been like a really battle of my 20s, I have to say. And then as I got older, I sort of finally sat them down and said, hey, I really need to do this for myself. And it was sort of, as I got older, it was okay. Especially because in my case, my parents also became more Americanized and they understood it as well.
I find that very interesting because in a collectivistic culture, the idea is that the family unit stays together and you have even multi-generational
Exactly.
families living
Yeah,
together. And so I had a similar thing where I was like, there was a point that I realized that like in Russian culture, like independence is not really a value. Not not in the sense that yes, you need to take care of yourself, you need to be like self-made and all of that, but not in the expense of being away from people you love.
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And
I
that
think that's a good
explaining
point.
that
Yeah,
and explaining that it's not a reflection on your family that you want to have your own place
that
was also an interesting
exactly.
experience for me.
For me, I would have to say that was the biggest clash. The other thing is, I think in my also think luck is that I personally think Israel and American culture has some similar values, but the way it's expressed is different. So Israel is sort of more direct, a little more, it's also moving to the same way. Still, people tend to live closer to their families, and there is family emphasis. Um, but in terms of timelines, like very typical sort of, I think even me on my expectation of myself, I thought I would be married by 30, have kids. Um, and it didn't, not because I don't want these things, it just didn't happen for many reasons, but it's not a tragedy. And I don't mean that it's for me personally not a tragedy. I still hope these things will come in the future, all of that. But what's
Mhm.
interesting is that my whole family sort of, especially my parents, we've had a lot of discussions, speaking of culture clashes, and that my parents are sort of realists and they're like, we just don't worry about it. Just find the right person, be happy. Of course, there's different dynamics where I would say my mother's sort of more traditional, of like worried what's going to happen with her daughter versus my dad, who's like, I'd rather have her find the right person, for example. Um,
Mm.
and so not that it's even, but even within familial relationships and all, it's not a trust. So, but there's also many different layers of clashes. There's layers here of being a woman. What did I think where I will be when I was a young girl? How does this reality reflect of it? Now this pandemic, it again makes everybody, I think, question like, what are the dreams that we have? Where will we be in a few years? And that's always being constantly reevaluated, I think, as an immigrant, but especially right now, I think collective as a society needs to rethink what it means as well, and what's important. So, so those are my big clashes, I would have to say, in terms of how I see independence, and in terms of timelines of success, and even what does even success mean? Because when I was younger, I thought that it was monetary was the success, and then sort of as I ended up getting there, and I still hope to continue having even more success and so on as I'm growing, and I see that, I sort of realized that it's the money on its own is good and needed and good, but being a fully successful person, I think everybody needs to define for themselves, number one. But number two, there's many facets of doing it. So it's about health, it's about physical exercise, it's about having the right people in your life. It's finding the right relationships to nourish you and sustain you, both romantic, both friends, both work-wise and all. So also success, I think as we grow older, I think we especially figure out that it's multi-layered. And as an immigrant, I think I get a lot more perspectives and understanding how the world is not black and white. It's super gray, and it will continue to be gray. And as an immigrant, I think you sort of might have that exposure earlier on in that the world is just simply grayer than you think. And that's not a bad thing. I think that actually is a good thing because it means, and I think we humans are very adaptive. And so I would
Mhm.
have to say, on a little bit tangent though, I think that's the biggest experience immigrant gets is that we're adaptive, and no matter what happens, you'll be fine eventually.
That's a that's a really
So,
beautiful realization.
yeah,
And I agree with you. I think being an immigrant, it kind of it's like in the background your whole life that you're exposed to different systems, government systems, and cultural systems, and you sort of
yeah,
realize that there's more than one way to be, and
yeah,
there isn't necessarily a right way. There are benefits and disadvantages in
exactly.
either system. Um, so actually, it's interesting that you said that you are adaptive because I actually wanted to say, in terms of personal growth and your insights as an immigrant, what are some of the big things you realized and gained? And the next question would be kind of like, how did it affect your career path and your relationships? But let's focus on the first one first.
So first one, there were two questions there. So what was the first one?
Just like in terms of personal growth, you said that you're
Yeah.
more adaptive and things are not as black and white. And what are other kind of what was your personal growth journey being an immigrant?
Yeah, so I think it's personal growth. Being an immigrant, I think, is from a young age. The way I was raised and the way I thought about myself is I thought I really needed to know right away what I wanted to do and who I wanted to be. And I think I think especially in the olden days, what I understood is people wouldn't choose majors based on what they wanted or choose careers based on what they wanted to do. It was more like, what's the most practical? You're a Jew. Go ahead, be a physicist, be a doctor, be an engineer, that sort of the paths. Whereas in terms of both in Israel and America, actually, I would say sort of the message that gets sent is be who you want to be. You can be whatever you want. And that's actually also the message I got. But so for me, I wouldn't say my career is a straight path line. At first, I thought, okay, I want to be a professor. And then I was like, I'm really interested in immigration law, actually. I thought I was going to be an immigrant lawyer. Um, eh, Actually, I wanted to do public policy in Washington, D.C., realized it's not that clear cut how to get there and make money at that. I think again, it's also the immigrant in me. I didn't feel like an American I can go and do an internship non-paid. Also didn't make sense, when you're a poor 19-year-old, my parents were like, we're not sending you somewhere far away where you're not making money and it's not clear. No, get yourself an internship, whatever, stay home. Like this doesn't make any sense for us. So there's also, of course, boundaries. Um, And then I was like, okay, I guess I'll study for law after. I majored in political science because I absolutely love politics, and to this day. Um, and so I did liberal arts, and then I studied for my law LSATs for the test, except I was exhausted afterwards, and I said, let me take a break and start working. And so I ended up sort of in client-facing positions from early on, worked at a few startups, typical Silicon Valley. And then after a few companies, I ended up in the current company I'm at, WSO2, that does technicals, API management tools, etc., for developers. And I sort of built my career in the tech industry. It wasn't a clear path, but the one thing I always loved and the thing that was important to me is support. So there were times where I special question, who am I if I'm not going to be a lawyer? Who am I if I don't really get this extra degree or something? And actually, my family was always behind me. They're like, "You're gonna figure it out. You'll be fine. Maybe we're not telling you. Maybe we are worried. That could be, but in general, you'll figure it out." And it has worked out. Another, the other interesting thing is, again, going a little bit back to different cultures, is I'm sort of expected sort of to continue studying, get a master's, etc. Whereas sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Does it make sense to get an MBA just to say you have an MBA? But that's an interesting perspective of being, of course, in the US and today's reality, how much a graduate degree makes sense. Everybody has, by the way, their own individual story. So in terms of how it has shaped my career, I don't know if to say like straight on it's because I'm an immigrant. I think if I would have been actually an American, I would be less stressed about the fact that it wasn't a straight line, actually. I think as an immigrant, I wished I had this straight line and I could tell you I always knew what I wanted to do, and what makes sense as well. So that's on the career front. Where it felt definitely in terms of my background coming to the forefront, subconsciously, by the way, I would say, is the relationships I pick. So virtually all my friends are all either immigrants themselves, like you, or children of immigrants, except maybe one or two really good American friends who are all around immigrants anyway. So that's an interesting thing, is if consciously I don't think an identity about being an immigrant or being a Russian Israeli American, even though I'm proud of who I am, you still sort of end up picking there as well. It works since I work, by the way. The other thing is why I don't think a lot about being an immigrant. I grew up sort of in the US in Silicon Valley and in LA, in all places were full of immigrants. I always worked in an environment of all immigrants, really, actually, since my career started. So it felt like to some degree it's normal to be an immigrant. And at the same time, of course, every immigrant has their own story, as you know, and is very unique. It's especially coming very much to the forefront when you pick sort of like romantic partners in relationship. I think that's a big one, especially as I am getting older, sort of what do I see it for myself? What do I see kind of the house I want to lead in? And actually, that's where, especially the identity of being an immigrant hits you very hard. Not that it's bad or good, but something if I subconsciously don't think about it that much in other areas of life, in terms of how I see myself for the future and partners and what's important, that's coming to the forefront, that there would be some sort of an understanding of the type of lifestyle idea and why I have the same sort of views that I do and what's important and what's not. So I especially see it in the relationships I pick, both on a friend level, both, etc. In my career, all my mentors actually and people that I work with virtually have been immigrants themselves. So that has not been necessarily on the career front. I see it. The way I deal with my journey, I think to an American audience would be a little bit more, well, of course it wasn't a straight line, that's fine. Whereas to sort of immigrant audience, I'm like, it wasn't a straight line, but it all worked out. But I think the end, interesting enough, is when you're finally reflecting on whether you're immigrant or etc., or even the career growth, when you're in the middle of trying to figure it out, it feels great. When you're on the other side and can look back, everything is like, oh yeah, it was like totally going to be this way, obviously. So that's a little bit about how I see. And I think in terms of my personal growth is adaptivity and understanding to navigate different cultures. I think that actually spills over career-wise as well, being able to navigate different personalities, different I'm dealing with a lot of different issues with customers as well, and business products and ideas and so on. Which actually, interestingly enough, I always had the thought back in my mind I should probably somehow get into product marketing. Um, but that's in general, I would say. So I think whether I consciously admit it or not, it's shaped my identity a lot and will continue to shape me actually even more the older I get, rather than what
Mm.
one thinks when you move as a child and then just a child thing and that's it, and then as an adult you're suddenly fully American. You're sort of a
Mhm.
hybrid, always,
Yeah.
I think.
I think that's interesting how you, because you're in a lot of customer facing roles, having all these different perspectives and knowing cultures and knowing languages, that's actually such a big advantage, right?
Yeah, it actually is. I think it's something I don't necessarily see, because I'm so used to the way I am. But I've actually had other people tell me as well that actually when in interviews, they're like, oh, your background is actually interesting to the role that we have. And they were actually right. That it could be that I personally just don't see it right away, the advantage. But actually others have told me the same thing, actually. Yeah.
Mhm. I mean, I think that also the older I got, the more cultures I've seen through living in the US and Canada is I personally realize that a lot of cultures fit into the individualistic model, which is Western or
Right.
collectivistic. So even though I'm Russian and somebody may be from Bangladesh, the main kind of ideas of a collectivistic culture are pretty similar,
Right.
and that allows me to relate easier to people from
Right.
similar
I
cultures.
actually work for a company that has it's based in Mountain View, but actually they have a huge office in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is actually a little bit more collectivist society. Um, and they were saying that actually one of the reasons probably so they get along with everyone is that they definitely get already ideas from the West. That's the other thing about today. Even if you live in a collectivist, sort of more traditional society, you still get sort of, American TV and the idea of what the American culture is. But that's actually an advantage for me with my coworkers as well and so on, is that there isn't such a big gap in terms of how we see things as somebody might think, because I understand to some degree that collectivist society as well. By the way, interesting you mentioned that. I think especially in a globalized world, or whatever the world will look like the day after this pandemic is over. In general, I think exactly that it's actually a bigger advantage. But the interesting thing is, I never thought about it that much, but that's actually very true. Agreed.
Mhm. Yeah. So I want to talk a bit about your career. And one of the things that interests me is, and one thing you said earlier in the interview is that you felt like being a woman allowed you to be more lenient in your choices. So I'm interested to dig in more on that. And also, in terms of confidence, and you've probably been in the workforce for
8 years.
almost 10
Yeah.
years, eight
Yeah.
years.
9 already. Crap, I'm getting older.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did your self-esteem and confidence grow in your professional career? And can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so let's start on the first, which I don't want to say I mean, it's not controversial that I think that I had more lenient choices as a woman. I think it is a little bit more controversial sort of to say it out loud, because it's not something that's necessarily pronounced or something that I would say. Um, but I think, at least in the way I grew up in the society, is no matter whether you're in Israel or the US or culture, is sort of the idea is that um, in general, one day, whether you're a man or woman, you're going to have a family. In general, how people make choices is their individual, but that's sort of where the thinking starts. And so the man is like, okay, you need to have a practical career and make a bunch of money, and then you will work for the rest of your life. Whereas attitude towards women is sort of changing, but I think it's not a uniquely immigrant thing. There's still always sort of the question is, and right now a lot, how do you have it all as a woman? So I was taught that I need to be smart, etc. But I was never sort of was told I need to make lots of money right away. You need to be independent, etc. But I think it's like, oh, because you're a woman, you're gonna have children one day, and etc. You can sort of choose for yourself, because whether it's right or wrong, your necessarily primary job in terms of what's not is not to be necessarily the breadwinner. I'm not saying that's exactly how things actually work out. I'm saying that's sort of the thinking where it comes from, in terms of the fact that I felt that I could be a little bit more lenient and sort of and really explore, rather than I wasn't fed super practical things where it's like, hey, you really need to get something super practical. At the same time, I think my own personality was very headstrong, like I want to do things my way and I'm going to do them my way and that's the way it's going to be. And that was fine because I already grew up sort of in the West. So I think the fact that it was a straight line is fine because I'm a woman. If I wouldn't, I think that would still be fine, but there would be a little bit more emphasis probably on practicality, and get a very practical major, etc. At the same time, I don't know, like on the other hand, sort of, I think my experience has been is that my parents are like, we know how to be software engineers. We don't know how the West works. If you want to be something else, you got to figure it out on your own. So that's where I think, in terms of, I will summarize and say, in terms of leniency, in terms of women, sort of the traditional way that you are gonna be a mother one day and gonna have babies means you sort of have a little bit more leniency regarding what you want to do with your life, because it's not your primary, quote unquote, primary thing to be a breadwinner. I'm not saying that's how practicality it works or they don't believe. I'm just saying from where the thinking comes from that I had a little bit more leniency. Because it didn't work out this way in my family. I don't think it's necessarily pronounced, but that's sort of what I felt. And regarding the question regarding confidence and building within the career, that's something that happened with time for sure. I'm definitely more confident today than I was when I started out, let's say, in my career. And the way you build self-esteem and the career, I think, is twofold. One, you actually get the experience, and you literally, I would say, you just do the dirty work. I remember the first time when I was 22, I picked up the phone and I talked to a CEO, and I'm like, oh my God, why is the CEO talking to me? Like, right now it's so funny to look back, but I was in a business setting, but I was like, he's talking to a 22-year-old. Oh my God. And I only gained self-esteem and confidence as I saw myself progress through the career and as I saw myself actually achieve. So the way I consider, I'm very practical in terms of how I consider success. Did I achieve A, B, C? Is the person happier? Did the sales go up more? And as I saw that, I sort of became more confident. It's important to have the right people around you. That's one thing I realized the older you get. But I would also say what the tweak is, no matter how much people love you or say you're great, not until you believe yourself and you did the work yourself do you feel like I'm actually great and I actually am good at what I do. So even though I always had excellent support, I would say not until I believe. So I think the peak in terms of really seeing what I do probably came around a year ago, where sort of I realized I'm handling big accounts and things are going well, and it didn't feel so emotionally or mentally tasking to do so. There are other challenges, but they're typical work challenges. But suddenly I realized I'm actually good at what I do. And the other interesting thing is there's, I think, a concept of a woman where there's many studies. Men are like, yeah, we're good, and they go. And whereas we as women, I'm like, no, 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 no. Let me see first. Have I actually good at? Now I'm going to say, okay, now I'm the boss and now I'm good. And so I think a lot of there in terms of personal career and esteem, I think has a lot to do actually with being a woman, actually, in terms of how I relate to it and whether I think I'm actually that good or not. That has been my experience in terms. I hope I answered the question. I already forgot what the majority of the other.
No, I think you brought up very interesting points, and actually, I've been reading the book, The Confidence Code, and I really recommend it, especially to female viewers. And it's two journalists who are doing research into like, are women confident? How can women be confident? They talk to so many people in science, biology, everywhere. And they also go to groups of people who are women, who are CEOs, political leaders. And it's amazing that even then, within their deepest heart, they still have this imposter syndrome. But the interesting thing that the book sort of talks about and preaches, that confidence is not a personality trait. It's something that you get from doing. And the more you do it, the more you believe the results, the more you believe yourself, which is very interesting. You don't obtain it, you don't somehow obtain it and then do things. You
Yeah.
obtain it by doing things.
Yeah, and it's interesting, by the way, speaking of an imposter syndrome, I mentioned earlier, I think that just the example I grew up with is interesting because my mom was a physicist. She built rockets, hella smart, still has had an imposter syndrome. Still, like, yeah, it's interesting because I, even my guy friends, even all the male friends in my life, I virtually don't know any guy that has the same sort of feeling in terms of an imposter syndrome as some of women do. Given that, I can think of a few examples of women friends that don't have an imposter syndrome. I can think of probably, if they're still here, I can think of a couple of them even listening here. And that's sort of who I try to look up to. I mean, I look up to everyone that's good, but it's interesting for me to see my friends that are women that are kicking ass and are doing well and not have imposter syndrome, because for some reason I do see that discrepancy in terms of
Mhm.
both women and men. And but the other thing I think is my personal view is also not to pay attention too much on it. So the other thing is, okay, you're feeling fine. Push that feeling, deal on the things you need to do, be very sort of practical on what you need to do. I think in my career thing, I think that's something that has helped a lot and will actually, another way I actually grew a lot, actually didn't touch about it, is I grew up in an environment, I think, I don't know if it's an immigrant thing or a me thing, where women to some degree felt always very stressed in general. Um, and it doesn't matter what, doesn't matter if things are good, small things you shouldn't stress about, etc. There was just this idea of something stressful. Um, and the men don't have that. And I'm sort of a combination of that. But I start career sort of always feeling stressed. Like even if things I look back are not things you need to be stressed about, um, it's I definitely got some of those genes in terms of feeling stressed. And so one of actually the biggest growth that I've had over the past 2 years is stop stressing. Focus on the things you need to do. Stop thinking about stress. And that actually has been for me another big thing in terms of career growth and actually helping in all areas of life. Stop
Mm-hmm.
stressing, because actually one thing I realized as I got older, stressing doesn't solve anything. It's some response, it's some might be survival response. I personally think it's also a little bit more like genetic and familial environment where you're sort of growing up in that. Um, and then once I sort of stopped it and tried to not bury it down, but stop stressing, and just whenever I feel a little bit like something is happening or some feeling, instead of stressing it, feel what I feel. But this pandemic is a good example of that, by the way. Some days I feel sad or anxious just because it's not clear and uncertain when the next day is coming, right? So
Mm-hmm.
then I let it be. Instead of feeling stressed, oh my God, I need to solve this, let it be, you know? And that's sort of something I also had in my career as well. I think the gained confidence is, okay, there's some big issue going on with the customer. They really need my help. I need to think outside the box. Thinking outside the box, by the way, also helps us in immigrant, by the way. Okay, let me deal with this issue. I'll deal with it later. The fact how I'm personally feeling about it, that's actually not too important. How I'm feeling about it, let's solve this idea at hand. When I
Mm-hmm.
got this mindset, I suddenly have seen all areas of my life just shoot up. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that I think something is with growth and getting older. And by the way, speaking of an immigrant, is realizing, first of all, it's okay that you're a bit different from obviously parents because you're a different person. But realizing the way things are done is not necessarily not, it's not the only way. And there might be better ways to do things. And once you realize that as well, it's like a relieving feeling. That's something I learned as well. I'm primarily thinking about it from a career perspective, but I saw this help out in all areas of life. That sort of idea of like maybe there's other ways to deal with things and more productive ways to deal with it, more proactive ways to deal with it. And once you do that, then you see the results change.
Mm-hmm. I think this is such a great way to close the conversation, all the insights you've given to people in their careers and in their life. And I especially relate to less stressing and less thinking that life has to kind of go in a straight path and be a certain way. And I think that is something that we get a lot from our backgrounds and our cultures, whereas here there's a lot more figure it out by doing, and it's not the end of the world. You'll be fine.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm very interested in your story, especially because I love hearing stories of people that have pretty much the same background as me, but have had a different family environment. Especially for me, the interesting aspect is how your parents let you figure out a lot of things from a very young age.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. To me, I think it's a little unusual in Russian culture,
Yeah.
but I find that because whenever I talk to you, you come off to me as a go-getter and very
Yeah.
independent, very
Yeah.
confident. Um, and so, yeah, I kind of feel like even if I met you at a 6-year-old, you would know where to go and what to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I want to say a little bit about the background I grew up in, at least. One thing I think I'm lucky is that, I don't know, I'm lucky. Everybody is different. I don't want to say that. But in the other thing, in terms of you speak, we have the same background, but we're a little bit different. That's something I felt, by the way, all my life, in that even people necessarily with the same background, okay, I grew up even a little bit different within that, which we talked about earlier. Um, I think interestingly enough, I think from the background I come from is even there was sort of a practical aspect that even my parents were even criticized, like, why don't your kids speak better Russian? Why can't they read or write from other family members? And I always went, but they speak English, so eyes on you. Um, but in general, I think they came with sort of, I think, like an open mind. I think they were sort of decided, sort of, we gotta get out of Russia. And there are generational differences. So I think to some degree, my parents already, when they moved out, they're like, we're open to what the West has to offer and how to do it, and we're going to incorporate that into raising our children. That's sort of what I see that. And that has sort of stayed within that way throughout life. So in Israel, I think my parents became very much sort of, they will never say they're Israeli, but they became understood a little bit of the mentality as well. In America, they sort of understand it a little bit more, and they gave us sort of freedom to sort of figure that out.
Yeah.
The other thing is it's also very individualistic. I am extremely different from my brother. My brother became a software engineer, and he just sort of follows the practical way. So there could be also a personality thing. Excellent question. There is two pressures. There's from myself and from the community. So the interesting thing is, in my case, is I always knew I wanted children since age 3. I always knew I wanted a family. At the same time, I always knew it's not going to be an the expense of finding myself, because that's the way sort of that it was clear. Um, so yes, absolute pressure, especially since I'm 30 right now, and my grandparents go, when are you going to give us great grandbabies? When are you, finding the right person? Yeah, I absolutely do have that pressure, but in my case, I don't understand why I have that pressure, because it's not like I'm anti. It's not like, no, I don't want a family, or I'm like, I haven't found the right person yet, and I want to sort of do it like in the right way. So there's absolutely pressure to start a family, but it's, there is sort of that thing within myself, like, why don't I have it by now? There's in the West where sort of timelines are sort of iffy. But yeah, I get the pressure from the community at this, but I don't under, for me, it's sort of what boggles my mind. I'm like, I am with you, and like, I would also like it.
But
Yeah,
I feel like maybe because it's Russian and Israeli culture, for them it's the epitome of your
yeah.
achievement as a woman, whereas we are both educated and successful, right?
So the way I see, so first of all, the way I personally view it, I don't think there's necessarily a big clash. I do think actually having a family is an achievement and having the right person. I actually don't discount. I think actually it's great, and I look forward to the day that hopefully it'll happen. So I don't discount that it's about. The problem is, exactly, the problem is we are studying longer, we're figuring it out longer. 30 today is not the 30 that my parents had. I'll even give an example, like my parents like, we didn't have any money and we had you. I'm like, no, 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 I want to have financial, and then I'll have a baby. There's also the difference in how you, exactly. So there is that some sort of a clash, but I think for me personally, the way I would say is our biological clock is not up to the standards we are in life today. And that's, I think, is the most important annoying thing as a woman. Because no matter what the culture is, no matter, etc., if someone wants to have a child, it's something that, unlike a man, like you, whether you want or not, you start thinking about it. Okay, what will it be years down the line? What will it be 10 years down the line?
Mm-hmm.
I personally think that's the most unfair, which you can't do anything about, unfair part of this equation, even more than whatever culture says and etc. Because I
Yeah.
personally think it's more important to do it with the right person, with the right circumstances, however it's right. But as a woman, you have that additional thought, no matter what it is, that biological clock is ticking, which
Mhm.
is very annoying.
But thank you everybody for tuning in. It was a great conversation. Thank you, Emilya. You are so insightful. I always
Great.
love talking about you about these topics.
Thank you.